Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a video where I'm going to talk about a topic I have talked about countless times before, the problem of evil. And it is concerning a particular area of that I've also talked about before, but it's going to take it another step, I wouldn't say further, but to understand the problem in a particular context, and then an extension of that, and an extension of that. So the problem of evil is the very well-trodden problem concerning why there is so much evil or suffering in the world, given that there is an all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful God. So if you believe that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, then why is there all of this suffering? Surely God would have the power to do something about it, would know what to do about it, and would be caring enough to want to do something about it. So why all the suffering? And suffering can be seen in so many different ways, and we often go to the absolute extent of suffering, like the top end of the spectrum. So for us, it's something like, I don't know, malaria or the Holocaust, or some huge event that has led to the death and suffering of tremendous numbers of people. But it's just as prevalent to the smallest amount of suffering. So stubbing your toe, because there can be no gratuitous suffering that even stubbing one's toe needs explaining as much as I guess, like, as far as it needs an explanation. Both of these, like the Holocaust and the toe tubbing, require an explanation. There can be no gratuitous suffering. So why is it that I stubbed my toe this morning? That really bloomin' hurt. That needs to be explained by an omni-God just as much as the Holocaust does. And if you can't explain the stubbing of a toe, then there must be gratuitous suffering, and then the omni-God is invalidated, because God would know what to do about this stubbing of toes, would be powerful enough to do something about that, and would be caring enough to want to do something about it. So what is the explanation for toe tubbing? What is the explanation for Holocaust, for malaria, for plate tectonics that bring about earthquakes and tsunamis? The 2004 tsunami that killed 240,000 people. What explains that? So those are the big ones and the little ones. But we can also think about other types of suffering, or other phenomena that need explaining in light of omnigod. And I talked to you previously about psychological conditions, something like schizophrenia or pathological demand avoidance that one of my boys has, autism, he's on the autistic spectrum. All of these conditions that might bring about, and I know some people say, oh, there's nothing wrong with autism, or there's nothing wrong with, you can live just as well, and there's great delight, etc., etc. But there are challenges associated with any of these conditions that aren't neurotypical. And yes, you can find an advantage, but on balance across a lot of these, so say something like some kind of clinical depression, right? That is something that you're going to struggle to say, well, actually, the world is a better place for clinical depression, or my life is a better life for having clinical depression. You can find certain scenarios whereby I came out through the other side and I'm a better person for it, so on and so forth. But in general, the idea that there are all of these different psychological conditions across the world is problematic, because I like to see things in terms of abductive reasoning. So the inference to the best explanation, which is to say that we have two scenarios. We have non-God and we have omni-God. You could say non-God, or a God that isn't omni-God, and omni-God. So maybe three scenarios, but let's just broadly forget other versions of God. Let's say either non-God or omni-God. And you say, okay, now we have these conditions, so clinical depression, and we can talk about stubbing toes, and we can talk about Holocaust, and we can talk about earthquakes and tsunamis and malaria, right? All of these things that they need explaining. Now, if I was to sit down, no, okay. So first of all, a world with these phenomena in them. Let's talk solely about psychological conditions. What best explains that? Does it better justify the belief that there is no God and shit happens and this is the universe we live in, and we can explain this through evolution and blah blah blah, etc., etc., or an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God. Holocaust, stubbing toes, malaria, but psychological conditions. And I find it difficult to put that in an all-loving God pot. I think, well, I better justifies believing that an omni-God doesn't exist. Because just from an intuitive point of view, like if and we can talk about things like Occam's razor. So as long as both these explanations do as good a job of explaining, then the one had the same explanatory power and scope, then the one with the fewer entities is more preferable. So if you multiply entities then unnecessarily, then that is a less preferable thesis for explaining something. And I would argue that an all-loving God, on top of just the universe existing, so now you have the universe existing and an all-loving God creating that, you're multiplying that entity unnecessarily, I would argue. So I think it fails Occam's razor, but also just intuitively, if I was to say to you, sit down and design for me, or give me a sense of your idea of a universe. So you are all loving, you are all powerful, you are all knowing, right? Imagine that's a situation. Now, if you were to sit down and design a universe from scratch with those constraints in place, do you think you would have a universe with black holes? Do you think you would have a universe with an eventual heat death of the universe? Do you think you would have malaria and plate tectonics and psychological conditions and rape and torture and the Holocaust? Like, is that the sort of world that you would imagine you would design? So you'd have to think, like, designing into this system the features of all of those things, the features of all of these psychological conditions. I think, why would God make it such that for example, my child has a tremendously challenging condition that makes it very much harder for him to interact successfully in the world, and it makes it much harder for me as a parent to deal with him? He's a real challenge, right? Is that what an all-loving God would do? Because it wouldn't be what I would do if I was sitting down and creating the universe. Now, I know, the universe, if it was all perfect, then there'd be no challenges, and you can still come up with these sort of arguments, but just the sheer range of psychological challenges in the world, and then physical challenges, like I've got progressive multiple sclerosis. Like, why the hell would you design that into the world? Like, why would the hell would you take from my children my ability to parent as I'd like to run with my children? I can't do that. I was a manager of their football team and helping coach their rugby team when they were sort of 6, 7, 8, 9, and then I got MS and I was unable to do that. I can't run. I can't move in the same way I'd like to. I fall over a lot. I can't kick a ball around with my boys in the back garden. I just physically can't do that. And so my children are suffering in their childhood. Like, we don't go out as much because I struggle to be mobile enough to have days out that are what you would think as normal days out, right? So my children are suffering on account of me getting multiple sclerosis. And actually, although you might say, well, they could benefit in this way, or they understand a bit. No, I would swap that for not having MS. Thank you very much. From my own personal point of view, it's horrible for me. I hate it. But I hate it for my children. My children are being robbed of experiences that they would otherwise have. And so therefore, the idea that they're being punished from my... So if you have an all-loving God and you say, well, you've got MS because you're somehow a bad person. Like, I can't explain MS very well with an all-loving God. I just don't know how you justifiably get through. I don't know how you can justify believing in that omni-God easily. You have to jump through too many hoops for me to be happy with that. But the most obvious one is that it's some defect in my character or something I've done where I'm getting punished for that, which I can kind of sort of understand the rationale behind that. But for my children to be part of that punishment is deeply unfair. Like, they didn't do what I did to deserve having MS, if that's some kind of reasoning that people would put forward. So I think that whole thing is problematic. Anyway, this is all preamble, by the way, because my final point, my extension of this, so it's a physical, the problem of evil in the context of death and destruction and war and all of these things. Those are the common, and toe stubbing. Those are the common examples of the problem of evil. Then I talked about psychological conditions that are hard to explain in light of an all-loving God. Now I'm going to talk about aging. So multiple sclerosis for me is personally very much like aging very quickly. So I start having cognitive load issues, my short-term memory goes, and my personality has changed slightly, and so on and so forth. There are things that are brought on by MS that look very similar to aging prematurely. My father has been diagnosed with dementia. My father is losing his ability to be the person we know him to be. His cognitive faculties are slipping away. And again, we are faced with the question, as with any data point in the world, and I've sure done a video on this before, I've certainly written about it, whereby everything you see around you in the universe, as a human being who believes in omnigod, has to be explicable by the existence of omnigod. So you look around and saying, well, why do colours exist? Why do leaves exist? Why do bricks exist? Blah, 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 blah. And of course, ultimately, everything has to be explicable with an omnigod because they created it from scratch. Although there might be certain systems that you create and just let them go that produce some of these results at the end. Actually, those systems that produce that are designed by God. And so therefore that needs... So if you're like, well, why does a capybara exist? Or, a lesser spotted woodpecker? You're like, well, okay, God didn't... It's still weird because he'd know all the things up front with divine foreknowledge. But even if you don't buy into the whole divine foreknowledge thing, the idea that God would know all future events and data points and phenomena with his or her or its incredible knowledge, even if you don't grant that, then you have to grant that God created the system that produced those end results, those outcomes. It becomes a little bit weird if you think God then produces these systems that don't really know what the outcomes are, because then you have God is random. God is producing systems like evolution. I don't know how this is going to go. Oh my goodness, we've got capybara and we've got lesser spotted woodpeckers. We've got human beings that, they're all killing each other. Oh dear. Either this is just a random roll of the dice, in which case you're stripping away God's omni skills, in which case you don't have an omnigod, because actually he's not omniscient, I would argue, because he has no divine foreknowledge of what is going to come to pass. Okay, so God knows what's going to come to pass. Okay, so he knows that he's going to produce a lesser spotted woodpecker and a capybara and humans that do X, Y, and Z. So everything needs to be, every phenomenon that you observe has to be explicable by God. I think in understanding the systems that he's designed, and also knowing that he's designed those systems with the knowledge of the outcomes as well. Hopefully that all makes sense. This is all just stream of consciousness, me talking nonsense. So going back to aging, like all of these data points, my father having this, your mother having that, all the people that we've known aging, all of the effects of aging, they've been designed into the system by God, by an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God. God knew that we would get old, lose our marbles, and start becoming shadows of our former selves, and actually sometimes horrible versions of our former selves, and sometimes actually just devoid of all the things that people know and love about us, and that causes great psychological harm to the people knowing them. Like, even though my father might not, well, he is cognizant of losing his marbles at the moment, and that is causing him quite a lot of distress, right? To have a man break down in tears in a way that he's never done before to my mother on numerous occasions throughout a week, this is affecting him, right? He knows he's losing his marbles. Why would you design that into the system? And then the effect that that has on us as children, losing our father bit by bit, dying every day to a different degree. Why would you put that on the children or on the loved ones? Like my mother just having to go through this, the strain this is putting on my mother. Like in a very, and I'm being quite frank with you here, but I, from my own point of view, I prefer to die in a car crash than get dementia and slowly mentally die on a daily, weekly, monthly basis until I was someone unrecognizable to the people around me. Why would you design that in? So that's dementia, but just aging in general. Like I'm I'm going to design people so that they have this youth, and you can understand youth and childhood and learning, and then you get to the optimal age where you're strong and you're marvelous and you're great, and it's yeah. And then you take that and you say, oh, you know that bit there? I'm going to torture you for the rest of your life until you die with your memory of when you were at your greatest point. Because from there onwards, you are just going to get worse in so many ways. So for me at the moment, okay, my MS is exacerbating and expediting these issues, but I am right now, today, the 18th of November 2024, it just so happens to be, I'm at the very best cognitively I will be for the rest of my life. It is all downhill from here. There is no getting better. There is no improving my cognitive abilities. I have a chronic illness that means that is the case. Now, okay, that's not aging, but essentially that is really kind of aging, where you're like, you get to a point where it is all downhill physically and mentally. You're like, okay, I can try and get fitter, and you can try and get a bit of a peak that bucks the trough trend, but essentially you still get, you can hold that off for only so long before age takes over. A 90-year-old is not going to beat a 35-year-old in an arm wrestle, essentially. And don't come up with examples where this is not the case. But you get my point, is that there is an inexorable, gradual decline, and often quick decline in people's mental and physical healths due to aging, where we are stripped of our former skills and abilities. And that seems to me a rather horrible way of designing life. I'd like a very quick end to that. Like you get to this great optimal point and you keep that going until you suddenly finish, rather than up and then down, and then you resent who you are at the end here, and the people that know and love you are absolutely distraught about who you've become. It's like a fragile shell of a human that has to be turned on their own body by nurses in a bed because you don't have the ability to turn over, and in fact you don't have the cognitive functions to know even who you are. My granny was like that at the end of her life, load of TMIs and didn't know who she was, would swear and stuff at the end of her life, and like that upsets her. That's not who she is. And then being a completely different human, and then not recognizing us, and we really didn't recognize her and who she was. And you're thinking, why is this whole situation a thing? Why would you design this situation into reality? So I would say suffering takes on very many guises, and we can talk about going from stubbing your toe to drowning in a tsunami. You can talk about malaria. You can talk about wars and human-based suffering, natural suffering and human suffering, and all that physical suffering there, which gives you actual pain to the point of death. That's one thing. Then you've got psychological suffering, and some of that will be as a result of that other kind of suffering where you're like, oh my goodness, my family's been wiped out in a tsunami. I'm now psychologically ruined as a result of that. Okay, but then you've got the conditions that you are kind of born with or you develop over your life, and you are racked with psychological pain and or challenge or anguish or anxiety, whatever condition you have gives you challenges that usually you'd say, I'd rather I didn't have these. So again, why has God designed that into the system? And then you have aging, which is it's kind of a form of both of those things, where you get kind of physical and mental degradation until the point that you die. and sometimes in line with sort of cancer and other things that come along precisely because you're actually living longer. So now that science and medicine has improved our longevity, there are side effects to that, which is now I've got a greater chance of getting cancer. And then we go through the same sort of arguments. But the point in general is that all of these elements of existence need to be explained in light of an omni-God. And I think it is much more likely that that these phenomena support the hypothesis that God does not exist, or omni-God does not exist, rather than a hypothesis. If you looked at all this and said, this is evidence of an all-loving God, I think you'd be met with like, really? Like, you picked out all the worst things in the world and you think that's evidence of an all-loving God. Okay. And then the question is, well, at what point does this become too much? Like, is there never a point? And I've made this argument before, that you could have your entire family tortured and killed by this all-loving God, and you could have the entire humanity killed. You're the last person. You've been tortured for 10,000 years solid, and you're there getting tortured, and you're thinking, yeah, no, there still could be an all-loving God. You know, I can still come up with some kind of contrived reasoning as to why an all-loving God exists. And you're like, okay, so... But for someone like me, I'd be like, yeah, so there's a spectrum that's almost infinite as to how much suffering that you can have before you go, okay, an all-loving God probably doesn't exist. I look at all of this and go, well, none of this data looks to me like evidence for an all-loving God. In fact, this is all evidence that an all-loving God doesn't exist. Omni-God doesn't exist. And so I think this is a challenge. And you can use that abductive reasoning two ways. So you can say, what of these two hypotheses does this data better support? Or you could look at it, predictively, or the other way around. You say, actually, let's start with these two hypotheses, and what would you predict if you had these? So what again, this goes back to, if you created a world, what would it look like? Like, if you stripped away all our knowledge about anything and said, right, okay, I know that's a bit problematic, but, you know, you're an all-loving God, all-powerful, all-knowing. You create a universe, what would it look like? What's your prediction of what the universe would look like? And the other one is, you live in an atheistic, naturalistic universe, and where shit happens. What would you predict reality to look like? And it's much more likely that this reality that we have now of all those horrible things is much more a prediction of and predicted by atheistic naturalism. So there you go. I'm just taking the problem of evil to the stage of aging, on top of psychological and physiological pain and suffering. Let me know what you think. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, and hopefully speak to you somewhat sooner than has been the case on this channel heretofore.